I recognized the car as I was approaching on Interstate 72 outside of Monticello. It had the unmistakable symbol of a Disciples of Christ church member or clergy, a chalice window cling in the back window of the car. Finally getting back to my wife and child after another grueling week of seminary studies in Indianapolis, I simply wanted to get back home as quickly as I could, even if it was a few miles over the posted speed limit. But here I was facing an ethical and moral dilemma. Do I just hurry past, hoping not to be identified by my former pastor? Or chose to slow down for a fewer than 50 miles remaining on my journey home? I chose to go a little slower than the speed limit to avoid being recognized. And I never have any identifying emblems or symbols on my car denoting my vocation as a pastor. Because I hate when people ask the inevitable, getting to know you better question of, what do you do for a living? Or what is your job, your occupation? And then I have to say, I am a pastor. And I know immediately where this conversation is going to go and where it's going to change and where it's now going to become awkward. Usually it's the last report of duty or attendance is coming to me. For example, I have not been in church since, or I used to be a part of such and such church. As a sign of the times, I suppose, it is getting less likely for me to hear, oh, I am attending such and such place. Do you know the pastor? Have you heard of it? Some work carries the burden of becoming who you are and what you do. For most of my life, I have not had a strict clock in, clock out occupation. Oh, sure, my contract says that I am a full-time expected 40-hour work week kind of job. But my experience has been my profession requires 365, 24/7. I am a pastor. Pastor am I. Do our roles in life make us, or do we simply inhabit those roles? I think both may be true. There have been times when revealing my career has been met with disbelief. But you don't act like a pastor. Oh, I know. I have heard some horror stories about those kind of people. Every pastor has an encounter with denial one way or another. Amos is the only prophet who denies being a prophet in the Old Testament. He wouldn't even go close to being a close relative of a prophet or by status or inheritance. He preferred to be known as merely a shepherd and a gardener, a caregiver for sycamore trees. That title of prophet does not apply. It's not an identity that he sought. Because Amos knows what we all know. Prophets in Amos's day meant something. They usually meant essentially a royal yes man that was proven rather quickly by his encounter with the priest Amaziah in Bethel, one of those royal temple centers. Prophets often were under the employ of the royal family to provide royal advice that surprisingly nearly always agreed with royal desires and requests. The king of Israel at the time, Jeroboam II, did not call Amos a prophet. God called Amos to prophesy to Israel while he was in the field with sheep or trimming his sycamore orchard. And certainly, God is not saying yes to Jeroboam and the people. But impending doom and destruction await both at the hands of the Assyrians. This shepherd and arborist is speaking treasonous words, or at least Amaziah thinks so, and should be sent away from the land of Israel. If Amos is not careful, such messages will likely lead to imprisonment or death. But it's telling what Amaziah describes his location as. This is the king's temple, which tells you all you need to know about Amaziah's idea of devotion to God. God's truth is being revealed, not by the paid help of Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, but rather Amos, a shepherd and arborist, while going about his usual work. Sometimes the path of God's revelation avoids the titled and reveals itself among the ordinary people who handle and bring forth things that flourish and live on a regular basis. Both flock and garden are nourished and grown by Amos's attention and care. It seems, though, that the land of Israel is about to fail under the so-called management of the priest Amaziah and King Jeroboam II. It is a telling contrast that God calls forth Amos to notice the harvest is failing, while Jeroboam and Amaziah are completely oblivious to it. Too often we fall under the influence of wisdom in the name of title and foolishness in the name of perception. Oh, you are not qualified to say such things. Titles simply do not reveal character, moral rectitude, or habits. Often titles conceal them. With God, our habits far outweigh any imposed or self-identified titles we may give to ourselves. What we do day in and day out reflect more our character and identity than what any identification might give us. What would be your job title if one tallied only your routines and habits? God seems to seek workers of the fields rather than titled representatives of royal households. Our psalm reading from Psalm 85 reminds us of a God who cultivates God's people with salvation and peace. His glory dwells in the land. Faithfulness springs from the soil. Righteousness looks down from the sky. Do you notice what's missing in this list of God's attributes present in the world? There's no mention of a facility, a temple, a chapel, nor are there any staff members with those exclusive marketing or membership privileges or rights here. by land, by ground, by sky even, God seeks to engage his people. But it seems that only the people familiar with such work, the day-to-day handling of seed time and harvest, of feeding and resting, of tending and trimming, can produce truly life-giving abundance. More often than not, those who have cut themselves off from these cycles tend to kind of fade away in their listening to God. True prophets reflect God's character in following God's ways in the world, not the world's ways to find God. Does your character reflect God's cultivation of salvation and grace and peace? I think the lesson for us today is that we should be wary of any prophet who relies on the grand and spellbinding, the sweeping proclamation, or the titled paper. Many certificate holders cannot even read a watch, let alone know what God is calling us to do right now in our day-to-day living and life. Do you know what you call someone with a master's degree in divinity, summa cum laude? Pastor. Do you know what you call someone with a master's degree in divinity with a D- grade point average? Pastor. Oh, and just a moment of personal information here. I was a B- Master's Divinity graduate. It is only in how we apply that its worth and value is revealed. We can have all the titles we want. We can be just like Amaziah, sitting proudly in the temple at Bethel. And yet be completely unqualified to speak for God. A God who calls tree dressers and herdsmen. A God who seeks out a carpenter's family, not sons of kings. A shepherd and an arborist can be a prophet without even seeking such a title. Life with God is more about disposition than entitlement or expectations. Faithfulness is revealed by the habits we keep and practice. To be faithful to our daily labor and calling is to be truly prophetic. Are you being prophetic in your labor for God? Life with God will always involve some form of on-the-job training. That seems to be part of our experience in living. Does your life cultivate salvation or peace? Or is it lost in some way, just fitting in to fit others' expectations? Because certainly Amos is an unexpected prophet whose words the land, as Amaziah claims, can no longer bear. Interestingly, we only have Amaziah's claims about this. We don't have a single word of the people of Israel not hearing or appreciating Amos's warnings. It is the case that sometimes shepherds and arborists are closer to God's call than priests or kings or rulers. Faithfulness does not necessarily require a title or a window decal or a card or other physical signs and evidence. But it does require training. And it is always prophetic. May we not be blinded by titles. May we be seeking to see the prophets in our midst who come from unusual places and callings, from the ordinary places of life, rather than the hallowed halls of temples and palaces. May our on-the-job training make us all prophets in our midst. Amen.